Hunting and gathering food. Coeur d'Alene. Roots and berries. Survival was uppermost in the minds of the Coeur d'Alene. Certain harvests were made each year in order to survive. They went to camas and bitterroot fields when these plants were in season. One of their most important foods and favorite vegetables was the camas bulb. There are two species of camas, and both were considered edible. Both bear blue or white flowers. A somewhat similar plant, Zygodinus venenosus, was called the death camas because it is poisonous to animals. In the Coeur d'Alene country, the camas bloomed in the latter part of April and the first part of May, depending on the lateness of the season. Camas was usually harvested during July and August. Coeur d'Alene women looked in areas where they had seen the blossom of many camas plants the previous spring. The Coeur d'Alene women dug the bulbs with a sharpened stick or a tool made of elk or deer horn. After the camas were brought to camp, they were peeled and washed, a long, tedious job done by several women, preparatory to placing them in the cooking pit, which was dug to a depth of as much as 3 feet. It was wide enough and long enough to accommodate the amount of camas to be baked. Digging the pit was a long, arduous, laborious job, too. After 2 or 3 days, the camas was well baked and ready to be eaten. Almost as popular as camas was another vegetable called cowse or couse. It belongs to the carrot family. Cowse was harvested during April or May. Its roots could be eaten raw or cooked. After it was dried and its brown outer skin scraped off, it can be reduced to a flour with a pestle and mortar. It then may be used in a soup or may be preserved in bricks for use at a later time. Cowse was called biscuit root by early explorers because it tasted like stale biscuits when dried. It tasted like parsnips, however, when eaten raw. They ate several kinds of wild berries. The berries were either eaten fresh or boiled. Blackberries, service berries, and chokecherries were all eaten fresh or dried for winter. Chokecherries were pounded into a pulp with the seeds left in. The pulp was dried into small cakes. The Indians gathered and ate many kinds of hard-shelled seeds. They used beaters to knock the seeds off the plants into baskets. The seeds were roasted using hot coals, then ground into meal on stone slabs or with a mortar and pestle. The meal was baked into loaves or cakes. Sunflower seeds were a favorite. They could be eaten raw or pounded into meal and baked into cakes. The Coeur d'Alenes sometimes ate snails and mussels. They found these in the lakes and streams in their area. Food storage platforms were elevated above the normal reach of hungry animals. Usually 4 saplings supported a platform which held bark or mat-covered containers of food. Sometimes a dead animal would be hung on a limb or placed in the tree as a temporary storage place. Salmon. The Coeur d'Alene Indians ate salmon that were caught below the main falls of the Spokane River. They shared this fishing site with the lower and middle Spokane tribes. Salmon were caught in several ways. First, they built fish traps in strategic areas in the river. Next, they built platforms out over the river and used nets to catch the fish. Third, they stood on platforms and rocks and speared the fish. Eventually, after the traders came, they started using a pole, line, and hook. Fish hooks were originally made of bone. Salmon were prepared in several ways. One way was to fillet the fish and put it on racks to dry in the sun. After the fish was dried, it was stored for later use. Salmon could also be smoked over a fire until it was ready to eat or to store without further cooking. Another way was to bake the salmon in a bed of coals and then eat it. There were different methods of baking the salmon. One method was to roll the fish in wet clay and throw it upon a bed of coals until it was cooked. The clay was then peeled off and the delicately cooked salmon was ready to serve and eat. Another method of baking was accomplished by wrapping the filleted salmon in wet grass and depositing it in hot, glowing coals until it was ready for eating. The wrapping of wet grass kept the fish from burning and helped retain the juices in it. Yet another method was to impale a fillet of salmon upon a twig or a stick and broil it over a hot bed of glowing coals. The Coeur d'Alene loved this fine food and shared it with their friends and neighbors. Visiting Indians from other tribes in the area were often invited to these salmon feasts. Deer. Deer were caught in great quantities by a method called the surround, which was done in the following manner. Prior to the hunt, worn-out moccasins and gloves were well smoked so that the deer or elk could smell them readily. These were placed on poles and stood at intervals in a large circle around an area where deer were known to abound. Men, women, and children with gloves, moccasins, etc., filled in between the poles and then slowly closed toward the center of the circle. In the larger, original circle, each moccasin or glove took the place of a person. But as the circle constricted, people with garments or blankets, which they shook when an animal appeared, were able to keep the panic-stricken deer inside the circle until the herd was within shooting distance of warriors with bows and arrows, at which time the deer were killed. A semicircle with both ends on the shore of the lake was used in the same manner. As the perimeter closed, the animals were forced into the water, where they were easily killed. It has been reported that as many as 750 deer were killed in one such surround hunt at Deer Park, Washington, during the early 19th century. Shooting deer and elk by wading along the paths that they made in going to and from watering areas was also a popular method of hunting them. Hunting animals while wearing snowshoes was an effective method used during the winter. Occasionally, animals were caught in snares and traps. Buffalo. They crossed the Continental Divide to hunt buffalo. Not all of the tribe went at one time to hunt these large beef animals because there were actually two seasons in which to hunt them, one for the bulls and another for the cows. Only a segment of the tribe went at any one time, and it often took a long while for them to return home, laden with dried meat and pemmican. When the hunting party returned, a division of the hunt was made, so that all members of the village received some of the food. In early days, buffalo hunting took an entire year. Buffalo were shot by brave men who went into the herd simulating those huge animals with buffalo hides on their backs and walking in a crouched position until close enough to use their bow and arrows. This was extremely dangerous and took a great deal of time.